Commander Zekthara stood at the observation deck of the Galactic Council's flagship, watching the blue-green marble of Earth grow larger through the reinforced viewport. His six-fingered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his ceremonial armor, the chitinous plates clicking softly against each other. The Velthari warrior had faced down plasma cannons and survived 3 galactic wars, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Nervous, Commander?" asked his aide, Lieutenant Mordak, noticing the subtle vibrations in Zekthara's mandibles that indicated anxiety among their species. Zekthara's large, multifaceted eyes reflected the Earth's light as he considered the question. The Velthari were known throughout the galaxy as fearless warriors, their insectoid appearance and razor-sharp reflexes making them formidable opponents. Yet here he was, trembling at the thought of meeting a human female. "The reports from our advanced scouts," Zekthara said, his voice carrying the distinctive clicking undertone of his people. "They speak of something called love, a concept that makes no logical sense." The lieutenant nodded gravely. Love was indeed a mystery to their species. The Velthari reproduced through genetic contracts, careful calculations of optimal bloodlines, and strategic alliances. Emotions played no part in their mating rituals. The idea that humans chose partners based on feelings rather than genetic compatibility seemed not just foreign, but dangerous. "Perhaps it is merely another human weakness we can exploit," Mordak suggested, but his tone lacked conviction. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what passed for disagreement among his kind. The intelligence reports painted a different picture. Human soldiers who fought for love proved to be the most dangerous opponents the galaxy had ever encountered. They displayed impossible courage when protecting their mates, performed feats that defied tactical logic, and refused to surrender even when facing certain death. The diplomatic mission to Earth had been years in the making. The Galactic Council needed human military support against the expanding Void Devourers, a mechanical race that consumed entire star systems. Every species had tried to stop them and failed. Only humanity, with their chaotic emotional responses and unpredictable tactics, had managed to slow the mechanical tide. But the humans had conditions. They refused to join the galactic military unless their cultural practices were respected and understood. This included their bizarre mating customs and their concept of love. The Council had reluctantly agreed to send cultural ambassadors to study human relationships firsthand. Zekthara had volunteered, partly out of duty and partly out of curiosity. As a military strategist, he needed to understand what made human warriors so effective. If love was somehow connected to their battlefield prowess, then it was his responsibility to learn about it, no matter how uncomfortable the concept made him. The ship shuddered as it entered Earth's atmosphere. Through the viewport, Zekthara could see the sprawling cities of humanity, their chaotic architecture so different from the orderly hive structures of Velthari settlements. Everything about this world seemed designed to promote individualism rather than collective efficiency. "Landing sequence initiated," announced the ship's AI. "Touchdown in New Geneva Spaceport in 15 minutes. Zekthara's thoughts turned to the briefing files he had memorized. He would be staying with a human family as part of the cultural exchange program. The family consisted of Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a xenobiologist, her parents, and her younger brother. Sarah had volunteered to host alien ambassadors because of her scientific background and her apparent curiosity about extraterrestrial life. The psychological profiles painted her as intelligent but emotionally driven, much like most humans. She had never been married, which the Velthari analysts found puzzling. At 28 Earth years, she was well past optimal breeding age by Velthari standards, yet she had chosen to focus on her career instead of reproduction. "Commander," Mordak said, studying his datapad, "there is something else you should know about this human female." Zekthara turned his attention to his aide, noting the uncertainty in the younger officer's posture. She has specifically requested to work with a Velthari ambassador. Her research focuses on insectoid alien species, and she believes our physiological similarities to Earth insects make us ideal subjects for her studies. A cold sensation ran through Zekthara's exoskeleton. The idea of being studied like a specimen was deeply unsettling. Velthari were proud warriors, not laboratory subjects. Yet this was the price of diplomacy. The ship touched down with barely a vibration, testament to the pilot's skill. Through the viewports, Zekthara could see the bustling activity of the spaceport. Humans of various sizes and colors moved about their tasks with the same purposeful energy he associated with worker drones, yet each one seemed to move with individual intent rather than collective programming. "Cultural note, Commander," Mordak said, consulting his briefing materials. "Humans often engage in a greeting ritual called a handshake, where they grasp each other's appendages. Our exobiologists believe this may be related to their pack-bonding instincts." Zekthara flexed his 6 fingers experimentally. The idea of deliberately touching an alien seemed incredibly intimate by Velthari standards. Physical contact outside of mating or combat was generally avoided in their society. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss, and Zekthara got his first taste of Earth air. It was heavier than the atmosphere aboard ship, rich with unfamiliar scents that his sensitive antennae struggled to categorize. Somewhere in the complex mixture of odors, he detected something that made his mandibles twitch involuntarily. A delegation of humans waited at the bottom of the landing ramp. Zekthara recognized the official diplomatic uniforms, but his attention was drawn to one figure standing slightly apart from the group. She was smaller than the others, with dark hair pulled back in what his briefings had identified as a practical style. Her clothing was less formal, suggesting she was not part of the official welcome committee. This had to be Dr. Sarah Mitchell. As Zekthara descended the ramp, his trained warrior instincts automatically cataloged potential threats and escape routes. But something strange happened when his eyes met those of the human female. For a moment, his tactical analysis simply stopped. Her eyes were an unusual color, somewhere between the blue of deep water and the green of new vegetation. More disturbing still, they seemed to be studying him with the same intensity he was accustomed to directing at enemy positions. The diplomatic pleasantries passed in a blur of translated speeches and ceremonial exchanges. Zekthara responded with the appropriate phrases his diplomatic training had drilled into him, but part of his attention remained focused on the human female who waited patiently at the edge of the group. Finally, the formal introductions were complete, and Dr. Mitchell stepped forward. She moved with a confidence that surprised him, showing none of the fear or disgust he had expected from his first direct encounter with a human. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about his appearance. "Commander Zekthara," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite its softer tone compared to the diplomatic officials. "Welcome to Earth. I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I hope you'll find your stay both comfortable and educational." She extended her hand in the gesture Mordak had described. Zekthara stared at the small 5-fingered appendage for a moment, acutely aware that dozens of eyes were watching this first contact between their species. His diplomatic training warred with his instinctive reluctance to touch an alien being. Taking what his people would consider an enormous leap of faith, Zekthara extended his own hand. The moment their skin made contact, something unexpected happened. A warm sensation spread from the point of contact up his arm, completely unlike anything in his previous experience. It was not unpleasant, but it was so foreign that his immediate instinct was to pull away. Yet he found himself unable to do so. Dr. Mitchell's grip was firm but not aggressive, and she held the contact for exactly the appropriate duration according to his cultural briefings. When she finally released his hand, Zekthara felt an odd sense of loss. "Your transport is waiting," she said, gesturing toward a ground vehicle that would take them to her family's residence. I thought you might prefer to rest before we begin our cultural exchange sessions." As they walked toward the vehicle, Zekathara found himself studying the human female's movement patterns. Unlike the rigid, efficient motion of Velthari, her gait was fluid and adaptable. There was a rhythm to it that seemed almost musical, though he could detect no actual sound. "Commander," she said, as they settled into the transport, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you're much more imposing in person than the photograph suggested." Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what he realized might be interpreted as aggressive display. He quickly forced them to stillness. "I apologize if my appearance is disturbing to you, Dr. Mitchell." "Disturbing?" She seemed genuinely surprised by his response. "Not at all. I find your physiological adaptations fascinating. The way your exoskeleton provides both protection and structural support while maintaining flexibility for complex movement is remarkable." This was not the response Zekthara had expected. Most species regarded the Velthari with a mixture of fear and disgust, seeing only the similarities to the primitive insects of their homeworlds. But Dr. Mitchell spoke as if she saw something admirable in his alien features. "Your research involves studying insectoid species?" he asked, genuinely curious now. "Among other things. But I'm particularly interested in the evolution of complex social structures among hive-based species. The Velthari represent one of the most sophisticated examples of individual consciousness emerging from collective programming." Zekathara felt a strange sensation in his chest cavity. Was this what humans called pride? The idea that this alien female could see beyond his frightening appearance to appreciate the complexity of his species was unexpectedly gratifying. The transport carried them through the human city, and Zekathara found himself paying more attention to his companion than to the alien architecture passing outside the windows. Dr. Mitchell pointed out various landmarks, explaining their cultural significance with an enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than merely polite. "That's the university where I work," she said, indicating a complex of buildings that seemed to blend organic curves with geometric precision. "I'd love to show you our xenobiology lab sometime, if you're interested." The idea of being voluntarily studied still made Zekathara uncomfortable, but coming from Dr. Mitchell, it seemed less like an invasion and more like an invitation to share something meaningful. As they pulled up to a residential area filled with individual family dwellings, Zekathara realized that his carefully constructed mental defenses against human emotional manipulation were already beginning to crack. This was exactly what the Council had warned him about. Humans had a way of making other species care about them, creating emotional bonds that could be exploited for strategic advantage. Yet as Dr. Mitchell smiled at him while gathering her belongings, Zekathara found it increasingly difficult to view her as a potential threat. There was something in her expression that suggested she might be just as curious about him as he was becoming about her. And that realization both thrilled and terrified him in ways he had never experienced before. The Mitchell family home was unlike anything Zekathara had imagined, where Velthari dwellings were designed for maximum efficiency and collective living. This human structure seemed built around comfort and individual expression. Colorful objects with no apparent functional purpose decorated the walls, and soft furniture invited occupants to rest rather than remain alert. "Mom, Dad, he's here!" Sarah called as they entered through the main portal. Two older humans emerged from what his briefings had identified as a food preparation area. The male was tall with graying hair, while the female was shorter and rounder with kind eyes that reminded Zekathara of Sarah's expression. "Welcome to our home, Commander," said the male, extending his hand for another of those strange, gripping rituals. "I'm Robert Mitchell, and this is my wife, Linda." Zekathara managed the handshake more smoothly this time, though he was still puzzled by the human need for physical contact during greetings. "Thank you for your hospitality. I understand that housing an alien visitor is not a small commitment. Linda Mitchell stepped forward with a smile that seemed to crinkle the skin around her eyes in a way that conveyed warmth. Nonsense. We're excited to learn about your culture. Sarah has been talking about this exchange program for months. Mom? Sarah said with what Zekathara was learning to recognize as mild embarrassment. You don't need to tell him everything I said. The family interaction fascinated Zekathara. In Velthari society, offspring showed absolute deference to their genetic contributors until they reached maturity and joined the collective. But these humans seemed to engage in playful verbal sparring that somehow strengthened rather than threatened their family bonds. Your quarters are upstairs, Sarah said, leading him toward a staircase. I hope the sleeping platform we arranged will be suitable. We weren't entirely sure about Velthari rest requirements. As they climbed the stairs, Zekathara noticed the walls were covered with images of the family at various stages of development. The concept of preserving memories in visual form was not unknown to his species, but these humans seemed to commemorate even mundane activities. This one's my favorite, Sarah said, pausing beside an image that showed her at a younger age, standing next to what appeared to be some kind of earth creature with fur and 4 legs. That's Buster, our old dog. He died last year, but he was the best friend I ever had. Zekathara studied the image, noting the genuine affection in the young human's expression as she embraced the creature. You formed emotional bonds with non-sentient species? Dogs aren't really non-sentient, Sarah replied with a slight defensive tone. They're incredibly intelligent in their own way. Buster understood my moods better than most people did. This was another puzzle piece in Zekathara's growing confusion about human behavior. The Velthari used various creatures for practical purposes, but the idea of forming emotional attachments to them seemed illogical. Yet Sarah spoke of this Buster with the same warmth she might use to describe a family member. The guest quarters were spacious by Zekathara's standards, with a window that provided a view of the family's vegetation cultivation area. The sleeping platform had been modified to accommodate his physiology, with supports positioned to avoid putting pressure on his wing casings. If there's anything you need adjusted, please let me know, Sarah said, lingering in the doorway. I want you to be comfortable during your stay. Zekathara tested the sleeping platform and found it remarkably well suited to his needs. The attention to detail suggested significant research and effort. This is more than adequate, Dr. Mitchell. You have clearly invested considerable time in understanding Velthari requirements. Just Sarah, please. And yes, I did spend quite a bit of time studying your species' physiology. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. I hope this doesn't sound inappropriate, but I've always found the Velthari fascinating. The way your society balances individual consciousness with collective purpose is remarkable. Zekathara felt that strange, warm sensation again, similar to what he had experienced during their handshake. No one had ever described his people as fascinating before. Terrifying, efficient, dangerous. These were the usual descriptors applied to the Velthari. Most species find us unsettling, he admitted. Sarah moved closer, her expression serious. That's their loss. From what I've read, the Velthari have achieved something unique in galactic civilization. You've maintained individual creativity and initiative while still functioning as a cohesive society. Most hive species sacrifice one for the other. The way she spoke suggested she had given this topic considerable thought. Zekathara found himself wanting to hear more of her observations, to understand how this human female perceived his people so differently from everyone else. Perhaps, he said carefully, you could tell me more about your research sometime. Sarah's face brightened in what he was learning to recognize as pleasure. I'd love that. But right now, you should rest. Tomorrow we can start the formal cultural exchange sessions." After she left, Zekthara stood at the window, watching the alien sun set over this strange world. The sky changed colors in a way that was both beautiful and slightly disturbing to his senses. On the Velthari homeworld, the binary stars created harsh, constant illumination. This gentle transition from light to darkness was something he had never experienced. His thoughts kept returning to Sarah's words and expressions. There had been something in her eyes when she looked at him. Not fear or disgust, but a kind of intense interest that made his exoskeleton feel uncomfortably warm. It was similar to how she had looked at the image of her dead pet, but somehow more complex. The next morning brought new challenges. Human meals were social events that involved the entire family gathering around a shared surface and consuming food while engaging in conversation. Zekthara's feeding requirements were quite different. Velthari typically consumed nutrient solutions in private, but the Mitchell family had somehow obtained appropriate sustenance for him. "We weren't sure about the taste," Linda Mitchell said apologetically, as she set a container of protein-rich liquid before him. "The supplier said it was similar to what your people prefer." Zekthara sampled the mixture and found it surprisingly palatable. "This is excellent, Mrs. Mitchell. How did you acquire Velthari-compatible nutrition?" Sarah drove 3 hours to the nearest xenobiology supply center, Robert Mitchell said with obvious pride in his daughter. "She wanted to make sure you felt welcome." Zekthara looked across the table at Sarah, who was focused intently on her own meal and seemed embarrassed by her father's revelation. The idea that she had invested such effort in his comfort created another of those strange, warm sensations in his chest cavity. "That was very thoughtful," he managed. The family conversation that followed provided Zekthara with his first real insight into human emotional dynamics. They discussed everything from Robert's work in atmospheric engineering to Linda's involvement in community service organizations. But the most revealing moment came when Sarah's younger brother Tommy joined them. Tommy was in his final year of education and preparing for military service. As he spoke about his plans to join the Space Defense Forces, Zekthara noticed the concern in his parents' expressions, quickly masked but unmistakable to his trained observation skills. "The Void Devourers haven't been active in this sector for months," Tommy said with the confidence of youth. "By the time I finish basic training, the threat will probably be over." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken worry. Sarah reached across the table to squeeze her brother's hand, and Zekthara witnessed something that made his mandibles click involuntarily. A display of protective affection that transcended logical assessment of military probabilities. "The Void Devourers," Zekthara said carefully, "are not a threat that simply disappears. They adapt, regroup, and return stronger than before." Tommy's expression grew serious. "You've fought them?" "Many times. They are unlike any biological enemy you can imagine. They learn from every encounter, incorporating new technologies and tactics into their collective intelligence." The family absorbed this information with visible concern. But what struck Zekthara was how their worry seemed to intensify their emotional bonds rather than weaken them. Sarah moved closer to her brother, while their parents exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. "That's exactly why we need the Galactic Alliance," Sarah said firmly. "Humanity can't face this threat alone." After breakfast, Sarah led Zekthara to a private study area where they could begin their formal cultural exchange sessions. The room was filled with scientific equipment and displays showing various alien species, but Zekthara's attention was drawn to a detailed holographic model of Velthari anatomy. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, noting his focus on the display. "I wanted to understand your physiology better before we began our discussions." The model was remarkably accurate, showing not just external features but internal organ systems and neural pathways. It represented months of careful research and analysis. "This is comprehensive," Zekathara said, studying the hologram. "Where did you obtain such detailed information?" Sarah's cheeks changed color slightly, a physiological response he had read about but never observed. "I may have submitted several research requests to the Galactic Council's xenobiology database. I wanted to understand what makes the Velthari such effective warriors." Zekathara felt something shift in his perception of this human female. She had not just accepted him as a diplomatic necessity. She had actively sought to understand his species with the same intensity he brought to studying enemy positions. "And what conclusions did you reach?" he asked. Sarah activated several displays, showing comparative analyses between Velthari and other species. "Your people have evolved a unique balance between instinctive responses and cognitive processing. Most hive species sacrifice individual initiative for collective efficiency, but the Velthari maintain both." She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. "I think that's why you're such effective warriors. You can respond to immediate threats with insectoid speed and precision, but you can also adapt and innovate like individuals. It's the best of both evolutionary strategies." No one had ever analyzed his species with such insight and appreciation. Zekathara found himself leaning forward, genuinely eager to hear more of Sarah's observations. "There's something else," she said, her voice becoming softer. "Your people's emotional responses are much more complex than most species realize. The psychological profiles suggest that Velthari are capable of forming deep personal attachments, but your society has conditioned you to suppress these tendencies." Zekathara's mandibles clicked sharply. This was dangerous territory, touching on aspects of Velthari psychology that his people preferred to keep private. Yet Sarah spoke not with the cold analysis of a xenobiologist, but with something approaching empathy. "You believe we are capable of love?" he asked, the human word feeling strange in his vocal apparatus. Sarah's unusual colored eyes met his directly. "I think you might be capable of something even stronger than human love. When a Velthari forms a personal attachment, it would combine the intensity of individual emotion with the absolute loyalty of hive bonding." The implication of her words sent a tremor through Zekathara's exoskeleton. She was suggesting that his species had not just the capacity for love, but for a deeper, more complete form of emotional bonding than even humans experienced. "That is a fascinating theory, Dr. Mitchell," he said, struggling to maintain scientific detachment. "Sarah," she corrected gently, "and I was hoping we could explore that theory together during your stay." Zekathara looked at this human female who had somehow seen past his fearsome appearance to identify capabilities he had never acknowledged in himself, and realized that his carefully planned diplomatic mission was becoming something far more complex and dangerous than anything he had encountered on the battlefield. The days that followed blurred together in a way that would have alarmed Zekathara if he had been thinking clearly. Each morning brought new discoveries about human culture, and each evening found him more confused about his own emotional responses. Sarah proved to be an insightful guide, showing him aspects of human society that went far beyond the basic diplomatic briefings. They visited museums where humans preserved their history, art galleries where they displayed creative expressions with no practical purpose, and even entertainment venues where they gathered simply to experience shared emotions. But it was the quiet moments in the Mitchell family home that affected Zekathara most profoundly. He watched Sarah interact with her family, noting how she balanced independence with affection, how she supported her brother's ambitions while still protecting him from harsh realities. Her behavior toward her parents showed a complex mixture of respect, love, and gentle rebellion that fascinated his ordered Velthari mind. "You're studying us again," Sarah said one evening as they sat in the family's outdoor area. watching Earth's single moon rise through the alien sky. Zekthara's mandibles clicked in what he had learned was the equivalent of being caught in embarrassing behavior. Your species continues to puzzle me. Your emotional responses appear chaotic, yet they somehow create stability. Sarah shifted in her chair to face him more directly. That's because emotions aren't actually chaotic. They're just complex. When you love someone, you don't always act logically, but you always act with their best interest in mind. The word love still created that strange warm sensation in Zekthara's chest. Over the past weeks, he had begun to understand that the feeling was not uncomfortable because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. My species believes that emotional attachments create weakness, he said carefully, that they compromise judgment and tactical efficiency. Do they? Sarah asked, her voice carrying a challenge. From what I've observed, you've become more effective during your time here, not less. Your reports to the Galactic Council show greater insight into human capabilities, and your strategic assessments have improved significantly. Zekthara was startled by her observation. He had not realized that his performance had changed, but reviewing his recent work, he could see that she was right. His understanding of human military potential had deepened considerably since arriving on Earth. Perhaps, he admitted, emotional understanding enhances rather than compromises analytical ability. Sarah smiled, and Zekthara felt that now familiar warmth spread through his exoskeleton. Maybe that's why humans who fight for love are so dangerous in battle. They're not fighting blindly. They're fighting with complete clarity about what matters most to them. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent communication from the Galactic Council. Zekthara's personal communicator activated with the priority signal that indicated immediate military necessity. "Commander Zekthara," came the voice of Admiral Kolthek, his superior officer. "The Void Devourers have launched a massive assault on the Rigel system. All available military assets are being recalled for defense. You will return immediately for combat assignment." Sarah had gone very still beside him. Even without understanding the alien language, she had clearly recognized the military urgency in the transmission. "Acknowledged, Admiral," Zekthara replied in his own language. "I will depart within 6 hours." When the communication ended, Sarah's face had gone pale in the way that indicated human distress. "You're leaving." It was not a question. Zekthara felt something twist painfully in his chest cavity, a sensation he had never experienced before. The thought of leaving Earth, of leaving Sarah, created an emotional response that threatened his ability to think clearly. "Military duty requires my immediate return," he said, falling back on formal protocol to maintain his composure. "The Void Devourers represent an existential threat to all organic life in this galaxy." Sarah stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the outdoor area, staring out at the night sky where alien stars marked the locations of distant worlds. "I understand. Of course you have to go." But her voice carried a tone that suggested she understood far more than just military necessity. Zekthara approached her carefully, noting the tension in her posture. "Sarah," he said, using her given name for what might be the last time. "These past weeks have been educational." She turned to face him, and he saw moisture gathering in her eyes, the human stress response he had read about but never witnessed. "Educational? Is that all this was to you?" The question struck him like a plasma bolt to the exoskeleton. Educational was the safe, diplomatic word that maintained proper distance between species, but it was also completely inadequate to describe what he had experienced in this human family's home. "No," he said quietly, "it was not merely educational." Sarah stepped closer. her unusual colored eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his mandibles tremble. "Then tell me what it was." Zekthara felt as if he stood at the edge of an abyss deeper than any battlefield. Everything in his training, his culture, and his species' history told him to step back from this emotional precipice. Yet Sarah's presence drew him forward with a force stronger than gravity. "I do not have words in your language for what I have experienced," he said finally. "My people do not name such feelings." "Then use your words," Sarah said softly. "Help me understand." Zekthara switched to his native language, letting the clicking, chittering sounds of Velthari speech fill the space between them. He spoke of the warmth that spread through his exoskeleton when she smiled, of the way her voice created harmonic frequencies that soothed his nervous system, of how her acceptance of his alien nature had changed his understanding of himself. When he finished, Sarah was still watching him with that intense focus. "I don't understand the words," she said, "but I understand the meaning." She reached out and placed her small hand against his chest, directly over the location where his primary heart maintained life rhythm. The contact sent shock waves through his entire nervous system. "I feel the same way," she whispered. The admission shattered something in Zekthara's carefully constructed emotional defenses. This human female, this soft, warm, impossibly brave creature, was offering him something his people insisted did not exist. A bond based not on genetic compatibility or strategic advantage, but on mutual understanding and affection. "Sarah," he began, but she placed her other hand against what would have been his lips if he had possessed mammalian features. "I know you have to go," she said. "I know your duty to your people and to the galaxy, but before you leave, I need you to know that these weeks haven't been just cultural exchange for me either." Zekthara felt his world shift on its axis. Everything he thought he understood about appropriate behavior, about the proper boundaries between species, about the incompatibility of love and duty, crumbled in the face of Sarah's simple honesty. "The Velthari do not engage in emotional attachments," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew the words were meaningless. His people might not engage in such attachments, but he was no longer certain he could speak for all Velthari. "Maybe it's time for that to change," Sarah said. "Maybe evolution isn't just about physical adaptation. Maybe it's also about emotional growth." Before Zekthara could respond, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips gently against his mandibles in what he realized was a human affection gesture called a kiss. The sensation was unlike anything in his experience, warm, soft, and somehow more intimate than any physical contact he had ever imagined. When she stepped back, Zekthara felt as if his entire understanding of the universe had been recalibrated. The careful distinctions between duty and emotion, between species loyalty and individual attachment, no longer seemed as clear as they once had. "I will return," he said, and the words surprised him with their certainty. "When this war is over, I will return to Earth." Sarah's face brightened with an expression of pure joy that made Zekthara's exoskeleton tingle with warmth. "Promise?" Zekthara thought of Velthari battle customs, of the sacred oaths that bound warriors to honor and duty. But he also thought of Sarah's courage in reaching across the vast gulf between species to offer understanding and acceptance to an alien being who had arrived on her world as a diplomatic necessity and become something far more precious. "I promise," he said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "When I return, perhaps we can explore what you call love, what my people might learn to call love." Sarah smiled, and in that expression Zekthara saw something that he finally understood completely. It was the same look she had given her family. The same protective affection she had shown her deceased pet, but deeper and more complex. It was love, and it was being freely offered to him despite every logical reason why it should not exist. As his transport lifted off from Earth 12 hours later, carrying him back to war and duty and the familiar structures of Velthari society, Zekthara carried with him something that no military briefing had prepared him for. He carried the absolute certainty that love was not a weakness to be exploited or a tactical disadvantage to be avoided. Love was the force that had made human warriors legendary across the galaxy. It was what gave them the courage to face impossible odds and the strength to protect what mattered most to them. And now, for the first time in Velthari history, one of their warriors carried that same force into battle. The war against the Void Devourers would continue, but Zekthara now fought with a new understanding of what victory truly meant. It was not just about tactical superiority or strategic advantage. It was about preserving the possibility of connection across the vast distances between stars, about protecting the chance for understanding between species that should have been impossible. Most importantly, it was about ensuring that he could keep his promise to return to a small blue-green world where a human female had taught him that fear and love were not opposites, but two faces of the same profound commitment to another being's welfare. And in making that promise, Zekthara had discovered that accepting love required far more courage than facing any enemy in battle. But the rewards were beyond anything his warrior training had ever suggested was possible.